All traditionalist Catholics agree that the Vatican II reforms, which began in the 1960s, were a disaster for Catholic faith, discipline, and worship. For the past 50 years, however, there has been an ongoing dispute within traditionalist ranks. How can we reconcile the obvious errors and evils of the reforms, imposed as they were from the top down, with the duty of Catholics to submit to the authority of the Roman Pontiff? The Recognize and Resist, or R&R wing, of the traditionalist movement represents one school of thought. It consists of the Society of St. Pius X, the followers of Bishop Richard Williamson, and the many devotees of publications like The Remnant and Catholic Family News. Its adherents insist one must recognize the post-conciliar popes as true popes, but nevertheless resist them by rejecting their laws, commands, and teachings. Others, like me, adhere to sedevacantism, a word originating with sedevacante, the expression in canon law for the vacancy of the Holy See. We maintain that the post-conciliar popes could not be considered true popes because of their public heresy. Accordingly, despite their white cassocks, these men could have no authority from Christ, so their teachings, laws, and commands would neither bind true Catholics nor compromise the infallibility and the indefectibility of Christ's Church. Sedevacantism is ultimately rooted in a basic theological truth that no one disputes. To be a member of the Church, one must 1. Be baptized, and 2. Profess the Catholic faith. Public heresy destroys the latter condition. You automatically lose your membership in the Church, and with it, if you are a cleric, your office or authority. The election of Jorge Mario Bergoglio by the March 2013 conclave was a turning point in this dispute. Due to the seemingly endless stream of outrageous public statements that Francis has made since then, who am I to judge? Doctrinal security is not possible. There is no Catholic God. Proselytism is nonsense, and so on. Many traditionalists finally embrace sedevacantism, and many more find themselves considering doing the same. And it hasn't stopped there. The controversy that Bergoglio and the October 2014 Bishop Synod provoked over the question of sacraments for the divorced and the remarried has even led to discussions in the mainstream religious and secular press of sedevacantism, heresy, and the prospect of a heretical pope, a possibility that would have been inconceivable even 5 years ago. This increased appeal of sedevacantism in the Bergoglio era has caused considerable unease in the R&R camp, as is seen from the number of anti-sedevacantist critiques its followers have produced since 2013. The arguments against sedevacantism that their authors put forward are essentially the same ones we first heard in the 1980s. But since then, the situation has changed. First, sedevacantist writers like me have shown that Catholic theologians eventually rejected the theories behind these old arguments. And second, we sedevacantists now base our position on a theological principle that the old R&R arguments simply no longer address. That because he was a public heretic, Bergoglio was not validly elected, so he had no papacy to lose. The anti-sedevacantists in the age of Bergoglio, in other words, are stuck in a rut. Wrong theologians, wrong issue. These 2 points are the topic of this video. Rut number 1, the wrong theologians. Over the past decade or so, a passel of civil lawyers from the R&R camp, Christopher Ferreira, John Salza, Brian McCall, and Robert Sisko have put out a whole boatload of articles attacking sedevacantism. These gentlemen argue that a heretical pope must first be put through an elaborate trial process and then declared deposed by the cardinals or a church council before one can say he is not really the pope. Given the civil legal system's blinkered and highly lucrative preference for the vague notion of due process over common sense and substance, one can easily understand why this scenario fascinates civil lawyers. Or perhaps these normally gray-suited contract, tax, and personal injury lawyers secretly imagine themselves all decked out in the colorful gear of Vatican legal functionaries, eloquently defending the Holy Father before a jury loaded with rascally sedevacantists. Be that as it may, as the basis for their arguments requiring a papal trial, these writers generally cite the 16th century theologians Francisco Suarez and Thomas Cajetan, the 17th century Jesuit Paul Layman, or especially of late, the 17th century Dominican John of St. Thomas. Impressive names in Catholic theology, of course. And the esquires, as part of their courtroom tactics, miss no opportunity to puff the qualifications of the expert witnesses they have called to the stand. Suarez as Doctor Eximius et Pius, Cajetan as trusted advisor to Pope Clement VII, and John of St. Thomas as one of the greatest Thomists the Church has produced. Well, okay, but whatever esteem these theologians may have enjoyed for their other opinions, the theology trained since the 17th century has quite definitively left their teaching on the question of a heretical pope back at the station. An abandoned opinion. The pivotal figure for Catholic theology abandoning the position of Suarez and company was Robert Bellarmine. Since the Church declared him both a saint and a doctor of the Church, he doesn't require too much puffing from me. In his great treatise De Romano Pontifice, published in 1610, Bellarmine examined 5 different theological opinions on the question of a heretical pope, and rejected the put the pope on trial first scenario that the R&R controversialists invariably cite. Instead, Bellarmine concluded that a pope who is a manifest heretic automatically ceases to be pope and head, just as he ceases automatically to be a Christian and a member of the Church. Before arriving at that conclusion, by the way, Bellarmine devoted 4.5 pages to demolishing the opinion of Cajetan, so beloved by the R&R bar. You can now read Bellarmine's arguments for yourself in the New English translation of De Romano Pontifice, published by Mediatrix Press. By the 20th century, all Catholic theologians and canonists who addressed the question of a heretical pope followed the teaching of Bellarmine and unanimously adopted his position that no trial was required. A pope who had been validly elected and later fell into public heresy lost his office automatically. Thus the position of great 20th century authorities such as Coronata, Besti, Vermeersch, Regatillo, and others. I have quoted their teachings at great length elsewhere, so it will not be necessary to do so here again. The massive 1943 Wernz Vidal commentary on the Code, however, will provide us with a typical example of this teaching. It says that a heretical pope loses his power, ipso facto, and also before any declaratory sentence from the Church. Bellarmine's teaching was even confirmed at Vatican I. One of the bishops present, Archbishop John Purcell, later related that the question about a heretical pope was asked at the council itself, and then answered by the council's theological commission. It was answered, said Archbishop Purcell, that from the moment he becomes a heretic, he is not the head or even a member of the Church. When he begins to teach a doctrine the Church knows to be a false doctrine, he would cease to be Pope, being deposed by God himself. If he denies any dogma of the Church held by every true believer, he is no more Pope than either you or I. This, by the way, puts to rest the oft-repeated and false accusation that the sedevacantist argument undermines Vatican I. The answer given to the question at the Council is identical to the principle upon which the sedevacantist thesis rests. Finally, we should note that Bellarmine's entire argument, as well as his systematic refutation of Cajetan and company, all rests on the simple principle we enunciated at the beginning of this video. Faith is a requirement for membership in the Church, and heresy, a denial or doubt of an article of the faith, takes you out of the Church. Superseded by a papal bull. The position of Suarez, Cajetan, and John of St. Thomas was not only abandoned in theory, but also superseded as a practical matter in canon law. This occurred in 1559, when Pope Paul IV promulgated the bull Cum ex apostolatus officio. The pontiff decreed that if someone was elected pope who had defected from the Catholic faith, he would be deprived of any authority and power by that very fact and without the need to make any further declaration. Faced with language like that, how can one possibly argue that the opinions of theologians who taught the contrary still hold any force? What part of without the need to make any further declaration don't you understand? Misunderstanding the term declaration. Those still stuck in the put the Pope on trial rut cite later theologians who, while accepting Bellarmine's teaching that a heretical pope automatically loses his authority, nevertheless allude to some sort of declaration by the College of Cardinals or the bishops. Here, for instance, is the Wernz Vidal commentary. A declaratory sentence is not excluded as long as it is merely declaratory. A contradiction, perhaps? Or a loophole that somehow supports the R&R, no trial, no loss of papacy, don't even think about a vacancy theory? Not at all. If our moonlighting lawyer friends had taken even a basic course in canon law, they might realize that the term declaration in this context merely reflects a general principle laid down in Canon 151 regarding appointment to a church office. If a cleric illegitimately functions in an office he has no right to, a cleric, say, whose installation as bishop of a diocese was forcibly imposed by the civil power, the prelate or electors who have the canonical power to confer the office may validly appoint someone else only if the illegal occupant's possession of it is declared not to be legitimate. Commentaries on the canon, like that of Moroto, emphasize that such a declaration is necessary to acquire proper legal title to a church office, and that without it, an appointment is null. So too, the purpose of a declaration by the College of Cardinals that some authors alluded to was not to remove or depose a heretical pope. Rather, it was merely a procedural requirement designed to clear the way legally for electing a new one, to tell the world in effect that the new guy, not the old one, is now the pope. Otherwise, there could be confusion. The heretic might still try to present himself as pope. He could barricade himself into the apostolic palace, or attempt to canonize saints and appoint other heretical bishops. Or in a situation perhaps not anticipated even by the Doctor Eximius et Pius, ride around in a stolen pope-mobile. The declaration by the cardinals in this context is analogous to a death certificate in civil law. Your rich Uncle Steve, the tech guru, may indeed be really dead. There's no pulse when you check for it under his black turtleneck. But to clear the way for you to get undisputed legal ownership to what he once owned, civil law requires that you first get a proper death certificate, signed by a doctor or other official. This will establish his death legally and give you clear title to his Apple stock, which you can then sell to erect a tasteful monument. Who are they to judge? Even if the Put the Pope on Trial first thesis still were a tenable theological teaching, its 16th and 17th century proponents assumed that while the Pope had publicly defected from the faith, all the cardinals and bishops still adhered to it. But in the post-Vatican II era, all the would-be cardinals and residential bishops professed the same fundamental set of modernist heresies as the would-be Pope. Yes, even the conservative and in-old crowd's favorite, the splendidly attired Raymond Cardinal Burke. They all adhere to the teachings of Vatican II, the teachings of Paul VI and his successors, the contents of the John Paul II Catechism, and the doctrinal decrees of the modernist Vatican. So, SSPX, the Remnant, and Catholic Family News are in fact urging us to embrace a practical absurdity. We should wait for heretical cardinals to declare a pope to be a heretic, and therefore not a true pope, even though he professes the same heresies they do. Should we perhaps wait to hear from Francis's Council of Eight before we can say he's a heretic? Would Cardinal Kasper say the charge was divorced from reality? Would Cardinal Maradiaga sound a note of caution? Would Cardinal Schönborn of Vienna say the matter has ballooned out of control? Would Cardinal Mahony warn fellow cardinals not to drink the Kool-Aid the sedevacantists are offering? Would Cardinal Tagle of Manila and Cardinal Solorzano of Managua insist on a more casual approach? Would Cardinal Dolan of New York opine that cardinals should not let such nonsense go to their heads? Robert Sisko, however, says he believes that we need a general council representing all the bishops of the post-Vatican II Church. They are the ones, he insists, that must issue a declaratory sentence of the crime and inform the faithful that the heretical pope must be avoided. I'm sure that his proposal would provoke a wave of enthusiasm on the part of the bishops. A lawyer friend of mine, and I do have a couple, once told me about what he and his colleagues call the red face test. You know your legal argument is far-fetched when you try to make it out loud and your face turns red. And that's exactly the problem here. The argument that the distinguished attorneys Ferreira, Salsa, McCall, and Sisko, and indeed many others make, just doesn't stand the red face test. This is because it doesn't stand the red robe test. The cardinals and bishops, whom they insist must sit in judgment over a post-Vatican II pope, are just as much steeped in error as the accused. When it comes to heresy, who are they to judge? Thus, the R&R camp's first rut. They endlessly reiterate a faulty general principle, an abandoned theological opinion, and expect us to ignore the sheer idiocy that would result from attempting to apply it in practice. Rut number 2, the wrong issue. By this we mean that in their attempts to refute sedevacantism, the partisans of the R&R position are now misdirecting their fire. They have not managed to focus on the fact that the fundamental theological principle behind the sedevacantist argument has now changed. This change began in the 1990s. While researching the question of loss of office by a heretical pope, we discovered yet another theological twist. Not only did a public heretic automatically cease to be pope, but also a public heretic could not even become pope in the first place. This, and not loss of office, is the principle that Sedevacantist now appealed to when discussing Bergoglio's status. As a public heretic, he was incapable of becoming validly elected a true pope. He has no office or authority to lose. The heresies that Francis has been spouting since his election did not suddenly appear after he donned the white cassock on March 13, 2013. Rather, his heresy was a pre-existing condition. One has but to look at Bergoglio's statements on religious truth, the objective moral law, proselytizing, the Jews, etc., in his book On Heaven and Earth, written with Rabbi Abraham Skorka when he was Archbishop of Buenos Aires. But these, remember, were merely spicy add-ons to the same fundamental set of heresies, ecumenism, religious liberty, Frankenchurch, that he already shared with the rest of the cardinals in the conclave. So anyone whom the conclave had elected would have been just as much a pope as Francis, which is to say, no pope at all. A heretic cannot become pope. The first and most important point to remember is that this prohibition is a matter of divine law, God's law, not just canon law. Numerous 20th century pre-Vatican II commentaries on the Code of Canon Law make exactly this point when they treat of the qualifications required for someone who is elected to papal office. Ernst Vidal, those capable of being validly elected are all who are not prohibited by divine law. Those who are barred as incapable of being validly elected are all heretics. Coronata, what is required by divine law? Required for validity is that the appointment be of a member of the church. Heretics and apostates, at least public ones, are therefore excluded. Badius, barred as incapable of being validly elected, are heretics. Cauchy, for the validity of the election as regards the person elected, it suffices only that he not be barred from the office by divine law. The following are therefore excluded. Those who are at least public non-Catholics. Sipos, any male who has the use of reason and who is a member of the church may be elected. The following, therefore, are invalidly elected. Heretics. The language of these canonists could not be clearer or more direct. A public heretic cannot become a true pope. God's law itself forbids it. This then, and not loss of office, is now the basis for the Sedevacantist argument. The sin of heresy. When confronted with established theological principles like these about the effects of public heresy in a pope, R&R controversialists, beginning with Michael Davies in the 1980s, sought to portray the status of heretic as virtually impossible to achieve. This they did by confusing two things: the canonical crime of heresy, that is, heresy is a criminal offense against canon law, and the sin of heresy. Heresy is a grave sin against divine law. To grasp the distinction, consider abortion. The act has a twofold aspect. First, as a sin against divine law, thou shalt not kill, that brings with it the loss of sanctifying grace. And second, as a canonical crime against church law, Canon 2350, that brings with it certain canonical penalties. A person who commits the sin of abortion may not necessarily fulfill all the additional legal conditions which must be present to be guilty of the canonical crime of abortion. These additional conditions are set forth in Canons 2199 to 2211 on the imputability of a crime. If you don't meet one of the criteria, you may indeed escape the legal punishment, excommunication in this case, but still be guilty of the sin of abortion. In the matter at hand, our analogy should be clear. Since the authors we quoted in the previous section said divine law prevents a public heretic from becoming pope, they meant the sin of heresy. So the R&R legal bar can no longer argue that all the various legal technicalities pertaining to the canonical crime of heresy must first be observed. If meeting all the canonical criteria were a requirement, rest assured that Wernz Vidal, Coronata, Badius, Cauchy, and Sipos would have explicitly told us so. Instead, they simply said divine law and heretic. And so it is the public sin of heresy that prevents Bergoglio and his kind from becoming true popes. The Orthodoxy Buddy. Be that as it may, it will be useful to discuss one special obsession of the R&R camp that arises from them mixing up heresy the sin and heresy the canonical crime. The supposed requirement for what I call an orthodoxy buddy. Just as you can't play tennis without a tennis buddy, so too they seem to believe you can't become a public heretic without an orthodoxy buddy. If you serve up a heretical proposition, an orthodoxy buddy slams it back by warning you it's heretical and please retract. Only after the third return do you become pertinacious, lose the match, and turn into a real heretic. In R&R polemics, this false principle surfaces from a stew like the one served up in this passage. Here, the ingredients include, first, a gratuitous assertion about divine law, that Titus 3:10 in effect establishes two warnings as a sine qua non condition for heresy to exist. Second, a false analogy, conflating tacit renunciation of office with penal canonical degradation. And third, just plain sneakiness. A means for establishing pertinacity in one sentence becomes a necessary means in the next. But the choicest morsel here is underlined in blue. The presence of pertinacity, Mr. Sisko assures us, must be confirmed. It is not presumed. In fact, however, even for the ecclesiastical crime of heresy, the legal presumption is against you, without any talk whatsoever of the need for a warning beforehand from your orthodoxy buddy. The very commission of any act which signifies heresy, says Mackenzie, gives sufficient ground for juridical presumption of heretical depravity. But in any case, procedural technicalities such as warnings would pertain only to the ecclesiastical crime of heresy, an offense against canon law. These are not necessary conditions, says the canonist Michel, for committing the sin of heresy, an offense against the divine law, which is our concern here. And errors in principles aside, just who do Messrs. Sisko et al. Think is supposed to function as official orthodoxy buddy for modernist heretics anyway? Another job for the Vatican II bishops, perhaps? Or does an orthodoxy buddy just appoint himself? How do you know he's so orthodox anyway? Does he have a buddy of his own to keep him in check? Who does he report your third fatal return to? If we applied the orthodoxy buddy rule to Jorge Bergoglio when he was the bus-riding Archbishop of Buenos Aires, it might work something like this. Bergoglio makes heretical statements publicly. Orthodoxy buddy gives warning number 1. Refusal number 1. Warning number 2. Refusal number 2. Warning number 3. Refusal number 3. Only then comes, poof, pertinacity, heresy, loss of your see. Once again, like the R&R legal bar's insistence that we need a general council to tell us that a post-conciliar pope is a heretic and no true pope, the argument that for every heretic there must also be an orthodoxy buddy doesn't stand the red face or the red robe test. When you imagine how it would work out in practice, and who would be expected to implement it, the argument evaporates into absurdity. Formal or material heresy, the same effect. When confronting the sedevacantist argument, R&R's last line of defense has customarily been the distinction between a public material heretic and a public formal heretic. A public material heretic is someone who externally denies a truth of the divine and Catholic faith ignorantly and innocently, and a public formal heretic is one who does so willingly and culpably. Only a formal heretic, their argument goes, truly puts himself outside the Church. A material heretic, Mr. Ferrer argues here, doesn't. The post-conciliar popes cannot be shown to have been formal heretics, either because no one warned them of their heresies, no orthodoxy buddies, or because, as liberals, their minds can't conceive of objective truth. This is Bishop Williamson's mente-vacantism, or empty mind theory. But an argument based on this distinction, like the put the Pope on trial first scenario, is no longer theologically tenable. It was shot down in the 20th century by Pius XII's 1943 encyclical Mystici Corporis. The theologian Van Noort explained. The same pontiff has explicitly pointed out that unlike other sins, heresy, schism, and apostasy automatically sever a man from the Church. For not every sin, however grave and enormous it be, is such as to sever a man automatically from the body of the Church, as does schism or heresy or apostasy. Note exactly what Pius XII teaches. The sin of heresy automatically severs one from the body of the Church. On the basis of this passage in Mystici Corporis, Van Noort goes on to explain why it is untenable to claim that public material heretics nevertheless remain members of the Church. If public material heretics remained members of the Church, the visibility and unity of Christ's Church would perish. If these purely material heretics were considered members of the Catholic Church in the strict sense of the term, how would one ever locate the Catholic Church? How would the Church be one body? How would it profess one faith? Where would be its visibility? Where its unity? And indeed, this is the dilemma we traditional Catholics face. If you insist that the post-conciliar popes, with all their myriad heresies, errors, scandalous public gestures, and faith-destroying laws, were still members of the Church before their election and afterwards, you destroy the visibility of the Church as a column of truth. So, R&R's last emergency exit, the claim that the post-conciliar popes were merely material heretics and therefore still members of the Church and also therefore true popes, has been slammed shut in the 20th century by Pius XII. Moreover, as I mentioned in Chapter 2 of Work of Human Hands, Mystici Corporis was one of several documents that Pius XII issued to rebuke errors being spread by the modernist wing of the European liturgical movement, whose adherents and supporters 20 years later would go on to give us the horrors of Vatican II and the new Mass. Since Pius XII lays down a principle which allows us to explain how the men who perpetrated these horrors could not have been either true popes or even Catholics, it is impossible not to believe that the pontiff promulgated Mystici Corporis when he did, thanks to a special disposition of God's providence. For those of us who, more than 70 years later, are still seeking to make sense of what happened in the Church, it came just in time, God's own time. The Pope by default objections. Defeated by an unassailable general theological principle that points to a logical conclusion, the R&R camp will no doubt fall back to several Pope by default objections, implying that these can somehow turn a heretic into a true pope by default. The Church must have a pope, and who else is there? Here are the common objections, together with my responses, based on the teaching of various pre-Vatican II theologians. Number 1. Vatican I taught there would be perpetual successors in the primacy. Response. Perpetual successors means that the office of the primacy is perpetual, was not limited to St. Peter alone, but a power that will perpetually endure to the end of the world. 2. A long vacancy would change the nature of the Church. Response. The monarchical nature of the Church does not prevent the Church for a short time after the death of a pope, or even for many years, from remaining deprived of her head. Her monarchical form also remains intact in this state. The perennial physical presence of the person of the head, however, is not so strictly necessary. 3. How could we get a true pope one day? Response. The various theories are direct divine intervention, the material formal thesis, and an imperfect general council, the latter of which is taught by the theologian Cajetan. Or perhaps we are living in the end times. 4. Sedevacantism destroys the visibility of the Church. Response. There is nothing to prevent the Church from being reduced to a small number. The Son of Man, when he cometh, shall he find, think you, faith on the earth? Moreover, the very purpose of visibility, the Church as a column of truth to the nations, is defeated by the heresies of the post-Vatican II body. 5. The universal acceptance of the post-conciliar popes confirms that they are true popes. Response. Circular argument. Heretics who are outside the Church confirm as the head of the Church another heretic who is outside the Church. Nice if you can manage it. And besides, Sedevacantists reject the post-Vatican II popes. What are we, chopped liver? So the acceptance is clearly not universal. 6. It is impossible that so many Catholics could be wrong and only the Sedevacantists right. Response. There seems to be no reason why a false church might not become universal, even more universal than the true one, at least for a time. Look closely at each of the objections again. None of them even pertain to, still less defeat, the underlying principle for the Sedevacantist thesis, that a public heretic who lacks the faith of Peter cannot by divine law obtain the authority of Peter. These objections do not even remotely answer the argument that we have made in this video. To insist that they do is to whistle past the graveyard. In making this video, our purpose was to examine the arguments against Sedevacantism made by groups such as the Society of St. Pius X, the followers of Bishop Richard Williamson, the Remnant, and Catholic Family News. We did not intend to present the whole Sedevacantist case, so we did not provide specific examples of the heresies Francis and his predecessors publicly professed. For this, we refer viewers to the many articles published over the years on traditionalmass.org, fathercekada.com, mostholytrinityseminary.org, and to the MP3s of Francis Watch available from restorationradionetwork.org. To an outsider, this dispute may seem to be a bit like an argument over inside baseball. But in fact, the underlying issue is one of ecclesiology, how to understand and apply Catholic theology on the nature, properties, and authority of the Church when the institution itself looks like Hiroshima the morning after. And while I have been hard on my opposite numbers in the R&R camp, for the benefit of a larger audience that may happen upon this video, I would like to conclude by making a point we would agree on. Conservative Catholics and those who promote the celebration of the Old Mass under the auspices of the post-Vatican II establishment are horrified by Francis. Their consoling Ratzinger-era illusions about a hermeneutic of continuity and a restoration brick by brick have all disappeared. This guy's a bomb thrower. He is their worst nightmare. You never know what crazy thing he will say or do next. So conservatives and motu proprio types in the Bergoglio era grit their teeth and wait for it to pass. The next pope may be better, they hope. So the restoration can begin then. But what they are seeing unfold daily before their eyes is not really a Bergoglio problem. It's a Vatican II problem. Francis, in other words, is not the real disease, but merely a symptom of the real disease. Its symptoms were a bit milder in the days of JP2 and Benedict XVI, but the council has steadily permeated, controlled, and sickened the whole organism. The in-your-face modernism of a Bergoglio and the ever-descending ecclesial death spiral of the Paul VI, John Paul II, and Benedict XVI eras are nothing else but the direct consequences of Vatican II. Only one cure will work. Dump Vatican II. Until then, the characters on the balcony of St. Peter's may change and play to the audience on the left or on the right. But the comedy that masks the tragedy will go on and on.